Okay, so in this section we're going to see how to set everything up in terms of where all the equipment goes, what plugs into what, and how to choose and place microphones, and generally make a great environment where everything just kind of works together. So let's take a look. So let's take an example where we have a mixer, and that's being fed from an onstage input box. It could be an I/O box that's been sent through on a network cable, or it could be a traditional snake that's going out there. And on stage, you have all of your stuff that's plugged into this onstage input box. Things like your drum kit. So in this case, you might have 8 drum mics, then maybe a couple of guitar amps that are mic'd up. Then a bass guitar, instead of that being mic'd up, you have a direct out coming out of that bass amp and being plugged into your onstage input box. And then maybe an acoustic guitar that is being fed through to a wireless system, and that wireless receiver then goes and gets plugged into your onstage input box. And then you have a bunch of vocal mics here. So count all of those up. You've got a ton of inputs that are all going in the direction of stage out to your front of house position. And then it goes backwards the other way. We're going to mark them by blue lines, and then that goes back to your onstage monitors. So the gray lines are coming from the stage out into your mixer, and then back from your mixer out to the stage on those blue lines. So really 2 directions of inputs and outputs, one from the stage and then one back to the stage. Now, as you plug in all these components together, you're going to have a myriad of cable types and connectors. Things like balance lines, unbalanced lines, quarter-inch XLR, RCAs. Let's break them all down. Things like keyboards and guitars will typically have quarter-inch jacks to them, and they can either be just a standard quarter-inch, or there can be a tip ring sleeve. You'll notice that there's an extra little path right here on a TRS, or a tip ring sleeve, or a balance line on a quarter-inch cable. Now, if you're bringing in microphones, they will typically be coming through on XLR cables. So for the most part, what you'll be plugging in and out will typically be quarter-inch or XLR cables. Typically, the quarter-inch cables coming from a keyboard or guitar are what we call unbalanced lines, which are susceptible to RF interference. Balanced lines use a really cool trick to make them reject outside interference like RF buzz and so on, kind of working like humbucking pickups on guitars. They send 2 copies of your signal down the line in a special way. We'll learn all about balanced lines in detail in the troubleshooting section, but for now, just know that long lines should be balanced so that they can reject all that RF kind of junk in the air. So, how do you change an unbalanced line into a balanced line? With a humble DI box. So here's our DI box, and what does it do? It takes our unbalanced line from our guitar and then does some voodoo. Like we said before, it takes a copy of that signal, sends down the original signal, the hot signal, and also a flipped out of phase signal down that balance line, and that balance XLR will go through to your mixer that does all of that cool balance line voodoo that rejects all the RF interference that might be coming to that line or introduced through that line, acting as an antenna, and gives you a nice strong signal, or a signal that can be boosted up without worrying about all that competing RF interference. So that all goes through the XLR, but it also does a parallel out, or a pass-through, that'll go through the amp. Great thing about that is that then the guitarist will be able to hear him or herself on stage, because that unbalanced line gets passed through and goes straight through to their amplifier. But here's the deal. What kind of instruments would be good for a DI? Well, say a bass guitar is a great candidate for that, because that can be sent through nice clean signal, can go through a DI box straight to the front of house position. Electroacoustic guitar, in other words, a guitar that has a pickup built in, is another great candidate for that. They're very clean signals. They can go through a DI box and go through the front of house position. An electric guitar, hold your horses. It might not be the best application of this, and this is why. Here is our electric guitar again. It's going through a DI box, going through to our front of house position. But here's the deal. It's also going through the onstage amp. And here's the deal, if you've ever met any electric guitarists. Have you ever met any electric guitarists? What do they turn up with? Do they turn up with just their electric guitar? No, they pull up with, you know, really nice $2,000 boutique amp, a bunch of effects pedals. In short, they've spent big bucks getting the tone that they want. And if you just take off just the DI, then you'll be missing out on all that raunchiness. They've spent a lot of money to make that sound really good. And guess what? You've tapped off a DI signal from them that is completely wimpy. It's just pickup to your front of house mix position, and you've missed out on all that raunchy stuff. All that raunchy stuff will be on stage, but you've missed out on it. How do you get that? Well, you just mic it up, and that way you have choice of whether you want to have the wimpy version and the raunchy version. Chances are you can just ditch the DI and then just mic up that electric guitar. Now compare that to a bass guitar, where it's quite often used that you will just get that bass guitar, just that dry bass guitar out of that DI box. It's perfectly acceptable just to take that dry bass and then just bring it up, and then you'll have a very clean bass guitar. If you do want to get some of that raunch from the onstage bass amp. In fact, you know, for the most part, that bass amp will just be used on stage so the bass player can hear him or herself. But if you do want to get that, then you can mic that up, and that way you'll have a choice between the dry bass and the amped bass as well. And then in terms of an acoustic guitar, electric acoustic guitar, in other words, an acoustic that has a pickup built in, then just plug that straight into your DI box. That'll go out to your front of house position. And in that case, DI box is just great, works fine. So DI boxes really help move low-level signals a long way while rejecting most RF. Think about it this way. Low-level sources like guitars and microphones need to be boosted up a lot when they hit the front end of your mixer on the trim or the gain pot. If you run a long unbalanced line to your mixer and boost that level up, then the RF will come up with it, and you're going to be hosed, because you need to boost that signal. A mic or a guitar produces a small signal, but boosting it virtually guarantees that all that RF will, make that completely unbearable. Run it on a balanced line, and because any noise picked up along that cable is cancelled out, you can boost that small source with confidence, knowing that the RF that came along for the ride has completely been cancelled out. So you need three things to make a fully balanced line: a balanced sound source, a balanced line, and then a balanced input. If you don't have all three of those, then this is all just academic. So a DI box takes that unbalanced line and makes a copy of it 180 degrees out of phase, sends it down the hot and cold, and over at the input, it flips that back up and does all the math to give you basically all the good stuff, which is a signal, and cancels out all the bad RF stuff. Now, another benefit of the DI box is that you can lift the ground if you have ground loops, and we'll look at that in a little while. So I hope by now you'll be familiar with all the connections and how everything fits together. Are you able to kind of see the flow of signal? Sound sources like a vocal mic or a keyboard or acoustic with a pickup all flow out to a mixer, which then flow out to the front of house, and then monitor sends back on stage. So let's take this flow and start from the sound source, specifically microphones, and we'll look at what the right type of mic is for the job and how to position them. So vocal mics, they're pretty easy to use. Just get them as close to the sound source, which is your mouth, as possible. Rest it on your chin if possible. If it's a lav mic, get it as high as you can, probably about here. Now, if it's head worn, get it really snug against your cheek. all of these suggestions are pretty self-explanatory, but let's tackle the big one, and that is drums. So here's what a typical drum kit looks like. We have our kick drum, snare drum, hi-hat, toms, and our overhead cymbals, our ride and our crash cymbals. And then let's go through each element in our drum kit and look at the kind of usual suspects in terms of what types of mics we use for each of these applications. We'll start off with a kick drum. So one to start off would be the Shure Beta 52. Also the Beta 91 is a good example. The perennial AKG D12, been around for a long time, and then the Audix D6. And then the EV RE20 or the PL20, they're both, they're actually coincidentally kind of used for voiceovers quite often, but they can be really used well in kick drums as well. Then moving on to our snare drums, we typically mic from the top of the snare drum. If you like, you can get some of the snap from the snares underneath the snare drum by miking underneath that as well. And boy, can you guess what the first one would be? That would be the Shure SM57. I'd like $1 for every time a Shure 57 has been placed over a snare drum. But here's some other examples. We have a Beta 56A, and an Audix i5 is a good bet as well. Then moving on to our hi-hats, an Audix SCX1HC, the Neumann KM185, and the Shure SM81 are all good choices. Now going on to our toms here, we can go with the Audix D2, the Shure Beta 98As, the Shure Beta 56As, or the Sennheiser 421 that's been used on toms for a very long time. It's a great example. And then moving on to our overheads, the Shure SM81, the Sennheiser E416, and the Audix ADX51. They're all good choices right here. Now, you know, in a perfect world, you better get the, you know, you'd get the most expensive and the best mic for each of these. I understand that that might not be plausible in your kind of situation. So let's have a look at some of the kits that are available, and there's a few that are made, and I would kind of categorize in the good, better, best. And in terms of if you wanted to get kind of an entry level, the Samson would be a good choice, then the Shure, and then if you want to get into really nice setups, the Audix would be a great choice there as well. So let's go ahead and look at exactly how you mic up all of these on a drum kit. Most drummers cut out a hole in the front head and place some dampening material inside the shell to prevent ringing and give the kick kind of a nice thud to it. Place the kick drum mic inside the shell pointing towards the beater. In terms of snare drums, place your mic right at the edge pointing down at the head at about 2 inches from the edge. Make sure that the mic is out of the way, you know, enough so that the drummer doesn't accidentally hit it from time to time. You can get away with just a single mic on the top of the snare, but also another one underneath it pointing up at the snares is a great way to capture the snap and buzz of those snares. Listen to just the top, then just the bottom, and now I'll blend between the two. The hi-hat mic should be placed about 2 or 3 inches from the hi-hats, angled in a way to prevent spill from other instruments, most notably the snare drum. The toms are mic'd in basically the same way as the snares, pointing down about 2 inches from the rim. You can move inwards towards the center of the head for a boomier sound. And finally, overheads are placed, well, they're placed overhead. And because the ride and the bell of the ride are quieter than the crash cymbal, then I would normally angle the right overhead in a little just to favor that ride. If any of you are lucky enough to have a Hammond organ going through a Leslie cabinet, here's how to mic it up. Now, a Leslie cabinet, as you can see, there's a couple of different parts. There's a low end, and we'll concentrate on that. mic that up using a mic that you'd normally use for a kick drum application, so it can capture that low energy coming out of the bottom end of that Leslie cabinet. On the top end of your Leslie cabinet, you have a rotating horn. So you definitely, if you can, set that up so that you can capture that spread by a pair of microphones. And if you want to think of an application, anything you'd normally use in drum overheads, I would definitely suggest using condenser mics up there if you can, and spread them apart. And then also back in the console, if you can spread them a little apart in terms of the panning, you'll get a great result, and you'll be able to feel that Doppler effect coming off of that top rotating horn. Now, in terms of pianos, normally you would use, there are a number of piano miking systems like Earthworks and things like that, but a typical situation is get a couple of condenser microphones and place them, one to cover the low strings and the other one to cover the mid and high strings. Now, in terms of miking up your acoustic string instruments like guitars, mandolins, and violin, many of these instruments will have great pickups or mics built in. Some have pickups built right in the bridges, others have small mics built in. Now, obviously, a great benefit is this: you just plug and play, just plug them into a DI box and send them on through to your console. And another benefit is that your performer doesn't have to hover around a static microphone. And that doesn't mean that we're talking about your fiddle player stage diving into the third row. I'm just talking about just natural movements that a performer will have, against a static microphone. That can dramatically change the volume and, more importantly, the tone of your source. Because a cardioid pattern microphone like this picks up dramatically more low end the closer you get to it. It's called the proximity effect, and can be used for effect if you want a thunderous, Barry White tone to your voice. Just eat the mic, get right up here. Obviously this isn't plugged in, I'm speaking through here, but you'll get a lot more low end there. But in terms of mic choices, if you did want to mic up an acoustic or a mandolin or a violin, I'd probably go with a condenser mic if you can. It's not the end of the world if you use whatever you have with it, some sort of dynamic microphone here, but you'll enjoy a lot more top end and clarity if you use a condenser. So aim at about 6 to 12 inches away, about half the way down the length of the string, and you can angle it a little bit more towards the sound hole on an acoustic instrument if you want to accentuate a little bit more low end there. Okay, so moving on to monitors. They are shaped like a wedge for a reason. Now, a microphone like this is designed to pick up sound from its top, right? It's virtually deaf from the back, and with a cardioid pattern like this, it couples really well with the angle that's coming up from the onstage monitor. All the sound that you want to hear in your monitors is coming up and hitting you in your ears, right? So you can hear yourself and the other band members, but the sound from the monitor, from those monitors, is also coming in at an angle, so it hits the deaf part of the microphone. So as long as you're angling your monitors up to you and having your mic orientated this way, you'll be pretty safe from feedback. Of course, if you have in-ears, you'll alleviate these problems, and you'll certainly reduce